Okay, quick question. Have you ever felt like you're always choosing between things, like to study or sleep, save money or go out with friends? That feeling? That's actually economics. And that's what AP Microeconomics is really about. It's not about money, not graphs, but it's about choices. In Unit 1, we're going to break down the basic ideas that explain how people, businesses, and even governments make decisions when resources are limited. Once this part clicks, the rest of the course honestly makes way more sense. So, let's begin. Okay, this right here is probably the most important idea in all of microeconomics. If this makes sense, everything else will just start clicking. Okay, let's start with scarcity. Scarcity just means this. You don't have enough of everything. Not enough time, not enough money, and not enough energy. And because of that, you're forced to choose. Even choosing not to decide is still a decision. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Every single choice comes with trade offs. When you choose one thing, you're automatically giving something else up. There's no such thing as a free choice. And that brings us to opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the next best alternative you give up when you make a decision. Not everything you give up, it's just the next best option. So, if you decide to watch this video instead of going out with friends, then the opportunity cost isn't everything you could have done. It's just the best thing you didn't choose. So think of it like a chain. Scarcity forces choices, choices create trade offs, and the value of that trade off is your opportunity cost. This shows up everywhere on the AP exam, in definitions, graphs, and real world scenarios. So if this idea feels solid, you're already a step ahead. Wait. Let's pause for just a second. If this part still feels confusing, you're not alone. This is one of the most mixed up ideas in all of AP Micro. A lot of students hear trade-offs and opportunity cost and think they're the same thing. They're related, but they're not completely identical. So let's clear it up. Trade-offs are everything you give up when you make a choice. You choose one option and there might be multiple other things you didn't get to. Now here's the key difference. Opportunity cost is more specific. It's the single best thing you give up, the option you wanted the most but didn't choose. So if you spend your Saturday studying AP Micro instead of hanging out with friends, watching Netflix, or playing sports, those are all trade-offs. The opportunity cost is just one of those you value the most. On the AP exam, they almost always want opportunity cost, not the full list of trade-offs. If you remember a best alternative, you'll get all these questions right. Alright, it's quiz time. Don't panic. This is just to check if the idea actually makes sense. Take a second and read this question. Okay, a student has 1 hour. They can do AP Econ homework, practice piano, or work a tutoring job that pays $20 an hour. The student chooses to work the job. Before looking at the answer choices, ask yourself one question. What did the student give up? Now, let's walk through this together. Option A says $20. Now, this may sound tempting, but that's the benefit of the choice, not the opportunity cost. So A is incorrect. B says piano practice because it's not monetary. But opportunity cost does not have to involve money, so that logic does not work. Option C says AP Econ homework because it improves human capital. Now, that is true, but the question never tells us which option the student values more. This is why the correct answer is E. Opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative, and that depends on the student's own preference ranking. We don't know whether the student values piano practice more than homework or homework more than piano. Because that information is missing, the opportunity cost depends on the student's preferences. Now, you may be thinking, what about option D? Option D assumes that we know which alternative is valued more, but the question never tells us that. On the AP exam, when preferences matter and ranking is not given, the correct answer is often the one that says it depends. Keep that in mind. So remember, opportunity cost is not about money and it's not about effort. It's about the best alternative you personally give up. If you think about it this way, these questions become so much easier. Alright, now let's move on to economic systems. On the AP exam, they usually frame it around 3 basic questions. What to produce, how to produce it, and who gets it. Let's start with a command economy. In a command economy, the government is in charge. The government decides what gets produced, how much, and at what price. This is what economists call central planning. There is very little room for individual choice, and supply and demand don't really get to do their own thing. So, if you see words like government control, central planning, or state ownership, you should be thinking about command economy. Now, on the flip side, we have a market economy. Here, decisions are made by regular people and businesses. Consumers decide what they want to buy, and producers decide what they want to sell. And prices aren't set by the government, they're determined by supply and demand through voluntary exchange. And this is where the invisible hand comes in. The invisible hand is basically the idea that nobody has to tell the economy what to do. People act in their own self interest, and somehow things still end up coordinated. Consumers are trying to get the best deal, whilst producers are trying to get the best profit. And prices adjust automatically to bring the market toward equilibrium. And we'll cover this in Unit 2. On the AP exam, the invisible hand does not mean the market is perfect. It just means resources are allocated without central planning. But here's the part students sometimes miss. A mixed economy is a mix of both systems. Most decisions are made by markets, but the government still plays a role. Things like taxes, regulations, and minimum wage laws are all signs of a mixed economy. And this is huge for the AP exam. Almost every modern economy you'll see is mixed. So if you're ever stuck between a market economy and a mixed economy is usually a safer choice. Think of economic systems as a spectrum, not boxes you have to force countries into. Alright, now we're getting into one of the most important graphs in Unit 1, or the only graph in Unit 1, the PPC, or Production Possibilities Curve. Now, this graph shows up everywhere on the AP exam, so let's make sure it actually makes sense instead of just memorizing it. I've memorized so many graphs in AP Micro and gotten so many questions wrong. Okay, at its core, a PPC shows the maximum combinations of two goods an economy can produce when it uses all of its resources efficiently. And that phrase right there matters. Maximum combinations, two goods, and efficient use of resources. If you see those words on the AP exam, they're talking about a PPC. Now, the PPC is really about three big ideas. First is efficiency. Any point on the curve means the economy is producing as much as it can with the resources it has. Points inside the curve are inefficient, and the points outside the curve are completely unattainable. You'll see how this looks like later on. Second is trade-offs. Because resources are limited, producing more of one good means producing less of another. And lastly, it's opportunity cost. Every movement along the PPC has an opportunity cost, measured by what you give up for the other good. On the AP exam, opportunity cost on the PPC is always shown by movement along the curve, not by money. Now, a really common PPC example is capital goods versus consumer goods. Think of machines versus pizza. Pizza gives you satisfaction now. Machines help you produce more in the future. So when an economy chooses more capital goods, it sacrifices consumption today in exchange for future economic growth. When an economy chooses more consumer goods, it enjoys more now, but gives up future production potential. This trade-off between present consumption and future growth is one of the biggest ideas the PPC is trying to show. So remember this, PPC equals efficiency, trade-offs, and opportunity cost, and capital goods today mean more growth in the future. Sometimes the PPC is a straight line, and sometimes it's curved. Let's start with a straight PPC. This PPC right here is a straight line, and that tells us something right away. A straight line PPC means constant opportunity cost. Why? Because the resources used to make chairs and desks are very similar. They're both wood, metal, and they use the same things, basically. If workers and machines that make chairs can easily switch to making desks, then every time you give up a chair, you give up the same amount of chairs to get more desks. Now, let's look at a bowed out PPC. A curved PPC shows increasing opportunity cost. That happens when two goods use different types of resources. Making pizzas uses cooks, kitchens, and ovens, and making computers uses engineers, factories, and advanced technology. As you shift more and more resources towards computers, you're pulling resources that are less and less suited for that job. So each additional computer costs more pizzas than the last one. This is called the law of increasing opportunity cost. The key takeaway here is that curved PPC equals increasing opportunity cost because resources are not equally efficient in all uses. So if you're ever asked why PPC is bowed out, the answer is not scarcity and not inefficiency. The correct answer is specialized resources. Now let's look at what different points on a PPC actually mean. A point can represent efficiency, inefficiency, and unattainability. Okay, first let's look at the points on the curve. Points A, B, C, and D are all on the PPC. That means the economy is operating at full efficiency. All available resources are being used, even in points A and D. On a test, if a point is on the curve, you should immediately think about maximizing resources. Now look at point F. Point F is inside the curve. This represents inefficiency. Some resources are being unemployed, underused, or misallocated. The economy could produce more of at least one good without giving up on anything else. If you see words like unemployment, recession, or idle resources, you should expect a point inside the PPC. Now look at point E. Point E is outside the curve. This point is unattainable given the current resources and technology. The economy simply cannot produce that combination right now. On the AP exam, outside the curve means unattainable unless there's an economic growth, like more resources, better technology, or increased human capital. So here's a simple way to lock this in. On the curve equals efficient, inside the curve equals inefficient, and outside the curve equals unattainable. If you can classify the points this way, you'll pick up easy points on the PPC questions. Now let's see what happens when the entire PPC shifts. This part is not moving along the curve, but it's the curve itself moving. Start with the curve in the middle. This represents the economy's current productive capacity. Now let's look at what happens when the PPC shifts outward. An outward shift of the PPC represents economic growth. This means the economy can produce more of both goods than before. Key causes of an outward shift include an increase in resources, improvements in technology, and an investment in capital goods. Notice how the entire curve moved outward, not just one point. And that's how you know this is a growth, not just a different choice. Now let's take a look at an inward shift. An inward shift of the PPC means economic decline. The economy's ability to produce has decreased, and this can happen because of natural disasters, loss of resources, or even war, or a decrease in labor force. Again, the key idea is that the whole curve shifts inward. Here's an important warning. Moving along the PPC means changing what you produce. Shifting the PPC means changing how much you can produce. If you remember that difference, you'll avoid one of the most common PPC mistakes. Outward shift equals growth, inward shift equals decline. That's it. Alright, it's quiz time again. This one's slightly more challenging, so take your time. A country's PPC is bowed outward because of increasing opportunity cost. As the country moves production from good X towards good Y, which of the following must be true? Okay, before we look at the answer choices, let's remind ourselves of one key idea. A bowed out PPC means resources are not equally adaptable. That idea alone is going to eliminate a few choices. Now, let's go through the options. Option A says the resources used to produce good X and Y are perfectly adaptable. If that were true, the PPC would be a straight line. So A is incorrect. B says opportunity cost decreases as more of Y is produced. But the question tells us opportunity cost is increasing, so B directly contradicts the information given. So B is wrong too. C says the PPC would become linear if more resources were discovered. Finding more resources will shift the PPC outward, but it won't change the bowed out shape. So C is incorrect. Now let's take a look at option D. Option D says the resources better suited for producing Y are allocated first. This matches exactly what a bowed out PPC represents. When the economy starts producing more of good Y, it first uses resources that are best suited for producing Y. As production continues, it has to use resources that are less suited, which causes the opportunity cost to increase. That's why the correct answer is D. Option E says producing additional units of Y requires giving up smaller amounts of good X. that will describe decreasing opportunity cost, which is the opposite of what we see here. So here's the key AP takeaway. A bowed out PPC means resources are specialized. The best resources are used first, and the opportunity cost increases as production shifts. If you see that chain of logic, you're able to handle these questions confidently. Now let's take a look at comparative versus absolute advantage. This is where a lot of people get stuck, so let's slow this down. We're talking about absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Let's start with absolute advantage. Absolute advantage just means who is better at producing something. If one person or a country can produce more of a good using the same resources, they have the absolute advantage. On the exam, absolute advantage is always about making more, no opportunity cost. It's literally just who can make more. But now let's talk about comparative advantage. Comparative advantage asks a completely different question. It means who gives up less. More specifically, who has the lower opportunity cost. And this is really important. Trade is based on comparative advantage and not absolute advantage. You can be worse at producing literally everything and still benefit from a trade if you have a lower opportunity cost. Now, let's talk about how to actually calculate opportunity cost, because this is where most mistakes happen. There are two main methods you'll see on the exam. First is the output method, and this is where OO comes in, or OOO. Output other goes over. That means the good you're calculating the opportunity cost for goes on top, and the other good goes on bottom. This method is usually used when the problem gives you output numbers directly. And we'll talk more about this later on. The second method is the input method, which is IOU. Input other goes under. This method is used when the problem tells you how many inputs like hours or workers are needed to produce each good. No matter which method you use, the goal is always the same. Find the opportunity cost and compare it. So here's the takeaway. Absolute advantage is about who is better, while comparative advantage is about who gives up less. And trade always follows comparative advantage. If you can keep these three ideas straight, the entire topic is much easier. Alright, now let's practice using the output method. The table here shows how much each country can produce using the same amount of resources. The US can produce either 20 cars or 40 corn, and the UK can produce 10 cars or 30 corn. So the first question is, who has the absolute advantage? Well, let's compare the numbers here. Well, 20 is greater than 10 and 40 is greater than 30. So the US has the absolute advantage in both goods. But who has the comparative advantage? Well, since this is the output method, we have to use OOO. Other goes over. So if we want to find the opportunity cost for the US for one car, well, we'll take that 40 corn and put it over the 20 car. 40 over 20 is 2. So the opportunity cost for one car is 2 corn. And we can do that for every other box in the graph. So if we compare the opportunity cost, we just have to see whose is lower. So if we do that, we can see that the US has a lower opportunity cost in cars, while the UK has a lower opportunity cost in corn. So the US should specialize in cars, while the UK should specialize in corn. Alright, now let's practice using the input method. This time, instead of being given output, we're given how many hours it takes to produce each good. The US needs 5 hours to produce a car and 2 hours to produce corn, while the UK needs 4 hours to produce a car and 1 hour to produce corn. First, let's find out who has the absolute advantage. In this case, we need to see who uses fewer hours. Well, the UK obviously uses fewer hours for both car and corn. 4 is smaller than 5 and 1 is smaller than 2. So, the UK has the absolute advantage in both goods. But who has a comparative advantage? This time, let's use IOU. So for the US, the opportunity cost for one car is going to be 2.5 corn. So other goes under. So 5 over 2 is 2.5. So the opportunity cost for the US for creating one car is 2.5 corn. Now let's see who gives up less. Well, the US, this opportunity cost for one car is 2.5 corn, which is smaller than the 4 corn. And the UK's opportunity cost for one corn is 0.25 cars, which is smaller than 0.4 cars. So the US should specialize in cars, while the UK should specialize in corn. Now I'm going to show you a little cheat sheet to find comparative advantage a bit quicker. Okay, so when you're given an output question like this, all you have to do is multiply the two numbers like this, diagonally. So 20 times 30 is 600, and 10 times 40 is 400. And since we're using the output method, we have to see which one's bigger. Well, 600 is bigger than 400, so the US has a comparative advantage in cars. Well, the input method is similar. Again, multiply the numbers like this. But this time, we need to see which one is smaller. Well, 5 is smaller than 8, so the US has the comparative advantage in cars again. Before we move on, let me ask you this. Why do countries even trade? Well, the short answer here is specialization. Countries specialize in producing what they're relatively best at, which means the good with the lowest opportunity cost. Instead of trying to produce everything, each country focuses on what it gives up least to produce, and then they trade for the rest. Now, this next question is just as important. How do they even trade? Well, the answer is through something called terms of trade. Terms of trade is the rate at which one good is exchanged for another. And for a trade to happen, the terms of trade must fall between the opportunity costs of two countries. If the trade rate is between both opportunity costs, both countries benefit. And that's why economists call a trade a win-win. Now, let's see why this actually matters. Well, firstly, total output increases. By specializing, the world produces more than it could without trade. Secondly, specialization benefits everyone. Countries get more goods using the same resources. And finally, trade is not about one side winning and another side losing. It's mutual gain as long as trade is based on comparative advantage. If you're still not so sure, let's try this MCQ. Country X and country Y both produce coffee and sugar, and we're told their opportunity cost for producing 1 unit of coffee. Country X gives up 3 units of sugar while country Y gives up 7 units of sugar. And that tells us something important. Country X has the comparative advantage in coffee because it gives up less sugar. Now, both countries specialize and start trading. The question is asking about terms of trade. Which of the terms of trade will allow both countries to gain? And remember the rule. The terms of trade must fall in between the both countries' opportunity costs. So take a look at the options. Well, the answer is obviously C, because 4 is in between 3 and 7. So therefore, option C will allow both countries to benefit. Now let's move on to cost-benefit analysis and the utility maximizing rule. Okay, before we go any further, we need to be clear on one word the AP exam uses a lot, which is cost. In economics, cost isn't just money. Cost means the value of what must be given up to get something else. Now, on the exam, costs come in 3 types, and if you could separate these clearly, a lot of these questions get a lot easier. First is explicit costs. These are the obvious ones. They're direct monetary expenses. Some examples are rent, wages, utility bills, and buying materials. If money actually leaves your pocket, that's an explicit cost. Second is implicit costs. This one is big for the AP exam. Implicit costs are your opportunity costs. They don't involve a direct payment, but they represent what you give up. For example, if you quit a job that pays $15 an hour to start your own business, that $15 an hour is an implicit cost. No money is paid, but value is still sacrificed. Implicit cost is basically your opportunity cost. Third, sunk costs. These are costs that already happened. They cannot be recovered. Some examples are non-refundable tickets, past tuition, and money already spent. Sunk costs should never affect current decisions. If a question asks whether to continue or stop something and mentions money already spent, that information is usually irrelevant. And you may have heard of the sunk cost fallacy from games like poker. You should never decide based on what you've already spent. Okay, to summarize this for the AP exam, explicit costs are paid with money, while implicit costs are your opportunity costs. And sunk costs are in the past and should be ignored. Now let's flip the question onto the final part of Unit 1. We've talked about cost, so naturally the next question is, what about benefit? In economics, Benefit means the additional satisfaction or value you get from a choice, not total happiness, not how much you like something overall, but the extra value from doing one more unit. That word extra matters a lot here. Now, let's combine cost and benefit using cost-benefit analysis. The rule is simple. Continue an action as long as marginal benefit is greater or equal to marginal cost. If MB is greater than MC, keep going. But if MB is less than MC, you should stop. And that logic applies to everything. Studying just one more hour, buying one more slice of pizza, or producing one more unit of output. Now, let's connect this to utility. Utility is just an economist's word for satisfaction. You don't need to measure it perfectly, you just need to compare it. And that brings us to the utility maximizing rule. To maximize total utility, a consumer allocates spending so that each dollar spent yields the same marginal utility. And that's what this formula is saying. Marginal utility of good A divided by price of good A equals to marginal utility of good B divided by price of good B. If those aren't equal, you can rearrange your spending and get more total satisfaction without spending extra money. So here's how the AP exam ties this together. Cost-benefit analysis tells you whether to continue an action, while utility maximizing tells you how to allocate spending across choices. Both rely on marginal thinking. Ooh, we covered a lot today. Thank you for watching, and you made it all the way. See you in Unit 2.